Welcome back to the future of river restoration, and back to the future of river restoration Northwest. Just as Marty McFly had Doc Brown to help him in his travels, both into the future and into the past, I was fortunate enough to have Pete Klingeman. And Pete was just a wonderful human being, just creative and supportive and a whole lot of fun to be around. And so I want to dedicate my talk today to Pete. So let's go back in time. I'm going to take us back to about 1994. I'm going to kind of bounce around in the past a bit, and then I'll look forward about 10 years. I don't want to look too far into the future because, as I guess we all know, hindsight is 2020. It's a little bit easier looking back than it is looking forward. But I'll take a peek into the future of where I think river restoration is headed. So let's go back to 1994. You may be asking yourself, why 1994? What's so important about that year? Well, for me personally, I had a lot going on then. I was in grad school doing research around rivers. I was working with Pete. It was a year that Luna Leopold published his book, A View of the River. And in the book, there were many, many wise words, but one that really spoke to me was the idea then that the river is the carpenter of its own edifice. What did Luna mean by that? The carpenter of its own edifice. It's an alluvial stream that kind of creates itself or recreates itself and controls what its morphology looks like. If we go back a bit further to 1978, this is a book by Dunn and Leopold, Water and Environmental Planning. And I think this may be the first place where Bankfull stage is defined and correlated to Bankfull discharge, this idea of Bankfull. Other authors previously had referred to it, but I really like the way that Dunn and Leopold captured this relationship, that the Bankfull stage corresponds to the discharge at which channel maintenance is the most effective. That is the discharge at which moving sediment, forming or reforming bars, forming or changing bends and meanders, and generally doing the work that results in the average morphological characteristics of channels. So I will kind of pull out the discharge at which channel maintenance is the most effective. So if we go back to that quote from Leopold, that the river is the carpenter of its own edifice, then wouldn't it follow that Bankfull discharge is actually the primary carpenter, because that is the flow that's doing the most maintenance and is the most effective. So I really like this idea of thinking about Bankfull discharge as the carpenter of the river edifice and really questioning, what does that mean? So let's go back to the 1994 book. So something else that Luna had said in here is that it's been mentioned that the Bankfull discharge has an approximately constant recurrence interval of 1.5 years in the annual flood series. So it happens at about 2 years out of 3. This is a remarkable fact that deserves discussion, and I completely agree. And this is actually part of the reason that I did the research that I did when I was at Oregon State University, was this very question about the 1.5 year Bankfull discharge recurrence interval. So armed with this information and kind of this general agreement about this 1.5 year event, I questioned it, like, why? Is this real? And can I go out and measure it? So I was working for the Natural Resources Conservation Service at the time, and I went and got into my government sedan, and I drove all over the Pacific Northwest to USGS gauging stations. I actually went to 130 gauging stations, some of which were in California, but this was my final data set of 82 sites. So all of these sites in one summer. So I got very good at finding USGS gauging stations. So I spent my time out there surveying, basically finding these locations, identifying Bankfull, and with my friends collecting everything related to Bankfull. So Bankfull width, Bankfull depth, discharge. That's why I had to be at those USGS gauging stations, was to back calculate to figure out what that Bankfull discharge actually was. And a number of years later, in 2001, we finally published a paper on this topic on Bankfull discharge recurrence intervals, and sure enough, discovered that it was about a 1.5-year event east of the Cascades. It was closer to a 1 to 1.2-year event on the west side, but it was definitely in that range of what was expected of that remarkable 1.5-year event. Like, okay. So I went out and kind of proved that to myself. That same year in 2001, there were a number of conferences around the country, but this one really kind of jumps out at me because it was the first really large conference about stream and wetland restoration projects. And there must have been hundreds of people there because there were hundreds of talks, and you can still find the proceedings online. But more importantly for this community, what was so important about this conference is that right after the conference at the airport, Pete Klingeman kind of pulled together a group of us and said, you know, this was a really fantastic conference, but I think we could do something more specific to the Pacific Northwest. We were doing a lot of restoration work involving large wood and some fairly innovative practices that were really focused on salmon recovery. Because in the Pacific Northwest, salmon was a driver and still is a driver for much of our restoration work. And in the mid to late 90s are when so many of our salmon populations were listed under the Endangered Species Act. So there were 5 of us that got together, and Pete, being his ambitious self, we got together in September of 2001, and he said, I think we can hold a conference next February. And I thought, good grief, Pete, how are we going to do this? But he was absolutely convinced that we could come together and build a community of practice in the Northwest that wasn't just for geomorphologists and engineers, but really had a combination of disciplines, was very interdisciplinary. And I remember that first year at Skamania Lodge, and we've been at Skamania Lodge the entire 20 years. We needed to have 90 people attend to break even. And Pete had reserved the lodge on his personal credit card because he just knew we were going to be able to pull this off. And we did have I think over 200 people attend that first year. And it's been going strong ever since. So 2001 was a really important year for many of us. In 2002, River Restoration Northwest, it was so successful that first year that we incorporated as a nonprofit. And our mission is to advance the science and standards of practice of river restoration through an interdisciplinary approach. And I think Pete would be happy to add on while having fun. And we would have theme parties every year, and Pete always enjoyed those informal get-togethers, really just getting to know each other, and again, developing the strong community of practice that we have become. Okay, so that same year in 2002, our evening speaker was Dave Rotskin. And so if you've been working in stream restoration for any period of time, you've probably heard Dave's name. So he came in and spoke with us. And if you know anything about Dave's design approach, about his classification system, it's really grounded in Bankfull discharge. Bankfull discharge is so important that he would say, if you don't know Bankfull, well, you really don't know much of anything. Because it is true in his system that Bankfull underpins kind of everything else. And so you spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what Bankfull is. Well, what I didn't tell you is when I was doing my PhD research, at all of those 130 gauging stations, I also classified the stream using the Rotskin classification system. And something interesting came out of that. There were 3 major stream types that were represented, and the others were almost completely missing. So USGS gauging station sites are a highly biased sample. Now, what this tells me is the USGS did a fantastic job of finding really good locations for gauging stations, because gauging stations are put there to estimate discharge. So you need to have a really stable cross-section that you can go across and measure velocities and then estimate what the discharge is. If you had a number of different channels, or if you had water out over a floodplain, extremely difficult to estimate discharge accurately. So USGS gauging stations in the sample that I have were primarily, they were single thread channels, pretty much below 2% slope. So that in Roskin's classification system, this comes out as B, C, and F channels. All of the streams were slightly to moderately incised. And that completely makes sense if you were going to go out and select sites for gauging. Now, in 2004, we were really lucky to have Reds Woolman come and give the evening talk. And he gave a fantastic kind of discussion about fluvial geomorphology and a lot of the history and so forth. And for me personally, I think Reds was my favorite speaker that we've had in the 20 years of river restoration Northwest. And that same year, Reds had a video come out called Identifying Bankfull Stage in Forested Streams of the Eastern United States. Now in 1996, Luna Leopold had a similar video come out about identifying bankfull in the Western US. So here are some of the founders in river science, Reds Woolman, Luna Leopold, talking about bankfull stage up into the mid 2000s. So this was a big topic of conversation and discussion. And if you're interested in those videos, you can still order them through the Forest Service. And I would strongly recommend that you watch these. It's really great to see some of these folks who are no longer with us and just to hear their voices and kind of see the passion that they have for river science. So if we jump forward to 2008, now we've got this big concept of bankfull discharge and how critical it is for channel formation and forming and reforming channel bars and what the meander patterns look like. But this concept is working its way into some of our design guidance, the way that we're approaching projects. And one example I wanted to share with you is stream simulation. Not because it's the only example, I think it works really well for our purposes today. So stream simulation, conceptually and very simply, the way I would describe it is if you're passing water, sediment, and large organic material at the same rates as the upstream and downstream reaches as you're crossing, then we're going to assume you have aquatic species passage. Now, from a practical standpoint, what you're doing is going out and looking at longitudinal profiles, so going down the channel, measuring the slope and looking at the pools and riffles and so forth, matching that cross-sectional area and shape, and then trying to mimic the roughness that you would find in the natural channel upstream and downstream. And once you've done that, then you've achieved stream simulation. And the other aspect of kind of bankfull discharge and why we were pushing for stream simulation, and many of us who work in the restoration field thought this was a really good approach, because now we're essentially making these crossings large enough to allow more normative processes, allowing for the movement, not just of water, but of sediment, wood, species, nutrients, and so forth. And so this idea moved from being in our design approaches and moving more into our regulations. So for those of you who've worked in Washington, you may be familiar with the 1.2 times bankfull width plus 2 feet standard. In Oregon, you'll often see 1.5 times bankfull width. And you'll see this show up in like programmatic biological opinions and other types of guidance documents and recommendations. And the whole point was to get these structures big enough. Now, unfortunately, sometimes what we come up with as a design minimum becomes a funding maximum. So we're saying we need this much space to allow these processes to occur. And then sometimes what happens is like, oh, if that's all you need, that's all we're going to fund, even if a larger structure might be more beneficial. So we run into some of these arguments where we've kind of moved the science forward, but it's in balance with some of our funding limitations. There is a diagram in the stream simulation guidebook. I think it's really fantastic because it shows this whole range of connectivity from the bottom, really looking at just hydraulic design to pass a certain flood. And then moving up, you start seeing, like moving for fish passage, we start seeing stream simulation all the way to the top of spanning the entire valley bottom. And I think we could actually add on kind of a timeline. Like when we look at pre-1994, a lot of our culverts were seriously undersized, even for flooding, but certainly for aquatic species passage and sediment and so forth. And you can see by 2008, we're really moving into the stream simulation world, and that's becoming more common practice. So maybe this gives us an idea of where we're headed. I wanted to point out, though, that in each of these scenarios, except the bottom one in the hydraulic design, everything is referenced back to Bankfull width. So that's our reference point, our reference channel. It's all about Bankfull width. It's all about Bankfull discharge. Now, also in 2008, there was a really foundational paper that came out by Walter and Meritz. And Dorothy Meritz was one of our speakers at RNW. Gosh, I can't remember how many years ago. Must have been the last 5 years or so. And Walter and Meritz came out with this paper, Natural Streams and the Legacy of Water-Powered Mills. And with that title, you wouldn't think this would just be kind of this earth-shattering paper that would fundamentally change the way that we think about rivers, but it did. And so this paper is in Science. If you haven't read it, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at it. It's quite short. And essentially what Walter and Meritz were looking at is this idea of this Bankfull channel. This single thread meandering channel was actually somewhat incised, and it was a post-industrial stream. So looking at the diagram, there was actually a buried soil horizon that was covered by a whole bunch of fill from these water-powered mills. So the channel that we see today is etched into this sediment, this post-industrial sediment. And they found this through doing cores and looking at the age of the different sediments. And so if we look at their abstract, a couple of things that pop out, that this idea of the classic meandering form, single thread meandering channel, guides a multi-billion-dollar stream restoration industry. And what they're saying is, maybe that's not right, because before European settlement, these streams were small and branching channels. Now, this was on the East Coast for a particular area, an area that Retz Wallman worked in quite a bit. And so there was a question of, well, how much does this apply in other parts of the country, other parts of the world? And it got a lot of researchers thinking about what streams look like, and are we actually seeing these single thread channels as being incised and not the reference channel that we might want to go back to. And that brings us to 2013 with the stream evolution model by Brian Kluwer and Colin Thorne. And so they read this paper by Walter and Meritz, and Brian is a pilot. He has his own plane, and he'd been flying around the West a lot, seeing these multi-thread anastomosing channels, taking pictures of them and wondering, maybe we're missing something here. Maybe this is kind of the stage or the reference that we're looking for a lot of our restoration work. And Colin had been doing some work as well, looking at channel evolution models. And so they updated these channel evolution models with the stream evolution model. And this is where the term stage 0 comes from. It is the pre-industrial kind of stream, the pre-disturbance stream. And so their argument is by the time you get to stage 1, that system's already slightly disturbed, and potentially that channel might be slightly incising. Now, certainly at stage 0, you could have one channel, multiple channels, or even no channels. So this starts prompting this idea of this floodplain reconnection and what floodplains and wetlands, what they should look like. So if we move on to 2016, this is a study by Cal Trout and Jacob Katz, really looking at how fish grow on floodplains. So fish grow on floodplains. The fish on the left were basically out on the floodplain, inundated floodplain for 3 weeks. The other fish were in the river or in a canal. So the difference in size has everything to do with how much they were able to eat in this 3-week period. So if you know salmon, then you know that the bigger they are when they go out to the ocean, the higher their survival rate. So being bigger is better. And so for an area where we're focused on river restoration for salmon recovery, this caught a lot of people's attention. That same year, Hauer and others wrote a paper about gravel bed river floodplains as the ecological nexus in these glaciated landscapes. So as the ecological nexus, these connected systems that had the complexity and the interaction of the surface water and the subsurface flows in the hyporheic zone and kind of that deeper groundwater. And they called these systems the most endangered landforms. It's the most endangered landforms. And I think that's really profound. Because when you take an endangered landform and you have your endangered species, you've kind of magnified the challenges in front of us. These highly connected floodplain, wetland, river systems can support species, through much of their life histories. And so it's really, I think, critical that we understand kind of all these kind of biological components and how they're fitting in with the physical processes as well. And this is where I really start seeing this integration of the ecology and the geomorphology coming really closely together. And in 2018, there was a paper that was published by Paul Powers, Matt Hellstadt, and Sunis Goda about a process-based approach to restoring these types of valleys to a stage 0 condition. And I really give a lot of credit actually to LIDAR. I think for many of us who have spent our careers in river restoration and working around rivers, LIDAR was one of those moments of just unveiling that we were able to see this detail. Now, LIDAR has been available for quite some time, but it hasn't been until the last decade or so, and certainly the last 5 years, where LIDAR is more ubiquitous, it's much more available, and the cost has come down. So when we see these floodplain systems and we can see all this detail in these historical channels and this microtopography that we just couldn't see before, I think it really opened the door to a lot more possibilities. So let's go back to that diagram from the stream simulation guidebook. So here we are at 2008 with stream simulation. Well, maybe in 2018, now we're at the top, right? That's that valley spanning structure of viaduct. And it's like, yeah, maybe this is what we're going after. But that's not quite what Powers et al. Were saying, or what I think stage 0 is trying to reflect. I think it would be more like this. It wouldn't reference that Bankfull width. The channels would likely be smaller and they would be shallower. And that's where I want to continue this discussion about the size of that channel, the size of that Bankfull channel. So we're going to get in the way back machine. I'm going to take you quite a bit further back to really see where this comes from and why we use Bankfull discharge, how we've interpreted it, how we've applied it. So we're going to go back to 1960. So this was a paper by Woolman and Miller about the magnitude and frequency of forces in geomorphic processes. And again, if you haven't revisited some of these older papers, I think it's well worth your time because some of the things that get excerpted or it gets referenced isn't exactly, I won't say exactly correct, but there are different reasons, purposes for using that information. So it's always nice to go back to the original document. This paper wasn't just talking about river systems. It was also, they were looking at sand dunes and they were looking at beaches. But this is the diagram that came out of it. I think that many of us are familiar with. And if you're not, that's all right. I'm going to go through in a bit of detail and kind of describe what Woolman and Miller were talking about. So here we are, kind of the cleaned up version of this diagram. So we have discharge on the x-axis, so discharge increasing to the right. And then we've got frequency of flows. So the dark red line, that thicker dark red line, is showing how often those flows occur. So you can see that lower flows occur quite frequently, and those higher kind of flood events occur very infrequently. Now, the lightest line that says sediment discharge rating curve, that's the amount of sediment that's moving for a given flow. So you can see that in lower flows, there's no sediment moving at all. And then you hit some point where the bed starts mobilizing, you get sediment discharge, and that amount of sediment that's moving increases as those flows continue to increase. Now, if you multiply those together, you get the effective discharge. This is a calculated value between the amount of sediment moving and the frequency of those flows. So the peak of that curve is called the effective discharge, which we just refer to as Bankfull discharge, with a return period of about 1.5 years. So I know there are going to be some purists out there who are going to say, wait a minute, Bankfull discharge and effective discharge are different things. And that absolutely can be true. This is a diagram out of the Leopold book from 1994, but it's work that goes back to Andrews, 1980. And this is for the Yampa River, looking at the correlation between Bankfull discharge and effective discharge. So I think it's safe to say that Bankfull discharge and effective discharge are really, really similar in gravel-bedded rivers. So for those of us who work in the Northwest, many, if not most of the streams we work on are gravel-bedded. If you are in a sand-bedded or a silt-bedded stream, this relationship does not hold. Okay, so back to effective discharge. Now I want to take you to a paper from 1979 by Richard Hay, Dynamic Process Response Model of River Channel Development. This one can be a little harder to find, but I think it is worth referencing because Richard has that diagram that I just went through for effective discharge, but that's not the only one he had, the set of curves. He had a whole range of curves that he looked at. And so I want to take you through these various curves and kind of what they mean and the richness of this paper. And I think what we can really learn from it and bring forward. So here's the diagram I just showed you. And this is what it kind of looks like blown up. So the same one I just showed where we've got our frequency curve 1, we've got our sediment discharge rating curve, which is curve 2, and the collective sediment discharge, that's curve 3. And in this case, sediment input equals sediment output. So it's one line. And when you multiply those together, the effective discharge is the flow doing the most transport. However, if our sediment input is less than our sediment output, then effective discharge is the flow doing the most erosion. And if our sediment input is greater than our output, so more of a depositional environment, effective discharge is the flow doing the most deposition. So there are different curves, different effective discharges, depending on what's going on in the channel, whether you're in a kind of a source transport or a response reach. And so if we go to Friars and Brierley in 2013, I think they've got a really nice diagram that catches this. And there's the source area where the sediment's coming from. So your supply, that's your supply area where you've got material kind of coming out. So your erosional area. We've got our transfer or a transport zone in the middle where sediment supply, basically sediment coming in equals sediment going out. And the bottom end, we've got our accumulation or our depositional zone, or our sediment supply is much, our sediment deposition is much greater. So we don't have as much sediment going out. And if we overlay Richard Hay's kind of diagrams on there, then you can see that depending on where you're working in the system, your effective discharge is going to be different. Now, the problem is that we have been taking kind of this channel design approach for transport reaches and really applying them to depositional reaches. And what we really should be doing is taking a different approach, right, for those depositional reaches. Now, keep in mind that USGS gauging stations, according to the data that I collected, are in transport reaches. Again, this is really important. If you're going to have a gauging station, you want to be at a location where material is just passing through and it's kind of maintaining its cross section. So effective discharge, bankfull discharge in transport reaches, completely valid. What I'm arguing is that if we're working in depositional reaches, that the same approach may not be appropriate. So let me just kind of show you what that looks like, maybe from a different perspective. So here's this lovely illustration out of a recently published paper from Ellen Wohl and a whole group of us. And so we're looking at this cross-section of a valley, and let's say we want to take a channel design approach. So what we would do is we'd figure out that channel size. How much water do we need in this channel to move the sediment through? You need quite a bit of water because you need that depth to get the shear stress to keep the sediment moving. So you design that channel, that ends up being kind of your bankfull channel or your 1.5 year event or your 1.2 year event to keep the sediment moving through. And whatever water you have left then goes up out onto the floodplain, and that's your level of connectivity. But what if sediment transport and sediment transfer was not your primary goal, but you had the space in a depositional reach where you could have not only connectivity, but you could handle some sediment deposition and floodplain accretion? Then you might take a floodplain design approach. So you'd be working from the outside in. So you start with how wide is your floodplain? How much space do you have? And the outcome of that process would be whether you had multiple channels, one channel, or no channels. So just to kind of recap, channel design, you're working from the inside out. Floodplain design, you're working from the outside in. And in many cases, you can take both approaches and kind of cross-check yourself. So moving forward to 2032. So I talked about where I think we're at, kind of moving into this really highly connected systems, multiple channels, multiple functions. I think our challenge in the next 10 years is really going to be understanding some of the connections between processes in many ways, like we try to understand trophic cascades. So we're learning more about denitrification and sediment storage, fish habitat. But what have we missed? The geochemistry, more information about the hyporheic zone, what species are living in those gravels. There are so many questions out there. And I think the next 10 years, we're going to be learning a lot more about this. Now that we're connecting these systems, we're spending the money to do that work. I think we will also spend the time and money to try to figure out what that actually means and what processes are being restored. And then we have the challenge, the huge challenge in front of us. This is a paper that came out in 2019, really looking at the kind of total flow throughout the year regionally. So if we look at the Pacific Northwest in the upper left, you can see kind of the total flow for the year, and it's kind of just by month, what fraction is moving out of that system. The green bit in the bottom, 4%, only 4% of the annual flow is on a floodplain of any sort. So I started off by talking about the importance of floodplains for salmon recovery, for many other aquatic species. But if only 4% of the flow is on a floodplain, what chance do we have to really achieve recovery? Now, one of the questions that might strike you, and it certainly struck me when I first read this paper, how much do we need? Like, how much could we get? What's our goal? And I don't know that spending our time trying to figure out how much we've lost, at what was that kind of pre-industrial level, because I don't think we'll ever get to that point. I don't think we'll ever have the luxury of saying, wow, we have too much floodplain connectivity. But I think we need more. And I do think that is where we're headed with restoration, these bigger, more complex projects, really reconnecting these river wetland corridors. Because floodplains that are wet are wetlands. And I think this is just one of those critical pieces of our thinking of really bringing together wetland restoration, floodplain restoration, and river restoration. So with that, I just want to take a quick look back at the board. So here's the board in 2002. There were 5 of us. 10 years later, we'd evolved into a board of 18 members. And many of those faces are going to look familiar to you. And just a fantastic group of people reflecting an amazing community of practice. And the board today are 12 people, and there are no founding members on the board. There are no past members that were there in 2012. So in 10 years, we've had a complete change in the board of River Restoration Northwest. Who knows where we're going to be in 2032? But I'm convinced that we're going to be a strong community, kind of sticking together, thinking of new ideas, trying new practices, sharing that information with one another, because that is the mission of the organization. And I think all the folks who are doing river restoration work, the goal is restoring these incredibly complex, critical ecosystems. So looking forward, where are we headed in the future? Well, I'll just leave you with this thought, that the future is beyond Bankfull. Thank you.